Yeah.
Coming to you live from the Goethe Institute in Johannesburg, wishing that you were all here. Lovely afternoon out, but because of COVID, obviously this is a mixed event, appropriately distanced. I'm some few meters away from my fabulous colleagues, but welcome to this event. I just want to welcome you all to what I hope is going to be a really cool and exciting discussion around digital media and social media and the elections. Obviously, with the elections just a few weeks away in South Africa and a few weeks away in Germany, it's a very opportune time for us to be looking at the role that social media actually plays in relation to the elections period. Now, most of us know that social media can play an incredibly powerful and positive role. It can help you know what's happening before everyone else does. You can use it to share voter education, voter information, critical events that are going on, places that they can go. Electoral bodies can use it to share their messaging, let people know, get out, get registered, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, we also know that social media and elections largely has been typified by the issues around mis and disinformation, around driving unawareness, disawareness, if you like, about the elections process. The IEC has been subjected to some disinformation over the last few weeks, suggesting that they either aren't credible or that they're too close to certain entities, and all of these things serve to undermine trust in the election process. And what I'm hoping we can get through today is find out what kind of lessons we can learn from experiences in Germany, and possibly what the Germans can learn from experiences here in South Africa. We've got an amazing panel, and I'll let our fabulous facilitator introduce them in a moment. But I guess the key things to think about as we head to these elections is, when you hold this device and you think about elections, is this going to be something that makes the elections better, that deepens democracy, or is this device and the content on it going to undermine our democratic process and our wish for a stronger democracy? I look forward to a great discussion. Over to you, Carnita.
Welcome to this very important discussion on the impact and relationship of social media and elections. It's hosted by the Media Monitoring Africa and the Goethe Institute and the German Embassy. My name is Conita Hunter, as William said. I am the political editor of News 24 in Johannesburg, and I'm delighted to be in your company this afternoon. Now, the importance of social media and elections, or in elections, cannot be overstated. Digital media has changed the dynamics of information, from how it is disseminated, how it is shaped, how it is consumed. It has created an opportunity for citizens to exercise their rights and freedom of expressions in ways that we have not seen before. However, it also comes with the challenges where it enables and emboldens those who wish to undermine democracy, those who wish to spread fear and anxiety. We have seen in elections around the world how some have used social media to push mis and disinformation, incite violence, and spread hate. And now by 2021, I don't think a single country has been spared this. It goes far back as 2012, the Mexico election. We saw it in 2016, the US election. And every year, as social media's reach expands, the perils become more and more sophisticated. The increase in the role of social media in political campaigns over the years has shown the impact it has on electoral processes and election campaigns. social media has the potential to deepen democracy. And that's a lot what we're going to be discussing today about how it can deepen participatory democracy and how it can help to ensure free and fair elections, which is a bedrock of any democratic society. But what do we need to do to ensure that it does not, that it does that rather, and not do the opposite? How does it not undermine democracy and elections? We're also in a very unique position today because South Africa and Germany are heading to the polls, and we can learn from each other because, like I said, it is a issue that affects every country and probably every election in the world. We have a very esteemed panel today that will be joining us in a second, but after they are done with their contributions, we'd love for you to post questions to our esteemed panelists. You can type it into the chat box, and we will have a time at the end of the presentations to go through your questions. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Today we're joined by Dr. Nomsa Masuku, who is an academic and a champion of civic and democracy education. She joined the Electoral Commission as a commissioner in November 2018. She was previously the Electoral Commission's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, responsible for outreach for 6 years. Before that, Dr. Masuku headed the Standard Bank's Corporate Social Investment Unit for 7 years. In the latter role, she focused her energies on harnessing the bank's resources to reach markets that could not be easily reached through traditional banking methodologies. You'd also be joined on your screen by Dr. Jan-Hinrik Schmidt, who has been a senior postdoctoral digital interactive media and political communication at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research, which is the Hans-Bredow Institute since November 2007. His current work focuses on the developments of Web 2.0 and social media. He's particularly interested in the changes of information circulation and opinion formation, as well as the practices and structures regulating digital communication. Thank you to Dr. Masuku and Dr. Schmidt for joining us. We also have with me here at the Schmidt Institute, Nomshado Lubisi, who is currently the head of communications at Media Monitoring Africa. She was recently appointed as a member of the South African Internet Governance Forum. She has led and implemented strategic communications initiatives for various campaigns and works on projects in digital literacy, media policy, and media research. She has spearheaded a dialogue seeking to address critical issues around communications and media. She has experience in marketing, digital media, public relations, training, strategic communications. I'm not done yet. Nomshado has key interests in digital media, youth development, gender, and media research. She's passionate about working towards narrowing the digital divide and advocates for combating mis and disinformation. Thank you everyone for joining me this afternoon. We'll start with you, Dr. Masuku, on the role of the election management body and social media and how it has impacted your ability to do your work. Whoever's watching will know that just very recently, the IEC was sort of faced the brunt of this on Twitter. How has social media changed the way the IEC has done its work?
Thank you very much, Konita, and I greet my fellow panelists and greet your audience. Let me first talk about, let me not assume that everyone knows what the Electoral Commission is, and rather just give a very brief overview of what the Electoral Commission is and what it is not. So the Electoral Commission in South Africa is a creature of its constitution. It is created in Chapter 9, and it is one of a handful of institutions that were created to entrench constitutional democracy. And I think that's very important. So it is meant to be impartial, to be independent, etc., etc. You might have heard conversations in South Africa arguing about why the Electoral Commission does not call itself the Independent Electoral Commission. We don't call ourselves the Independent Electoral Commission because it is already assumed in Chapter 9 that we are independent. We are just the Electoral Commission of South Africa. And the other characteristics of the independence, of the impartiality, etc., they apply equally to the other organizations as well. The specific role of the Electoral Commission is threefold. It is to manage elections of national, provincial, and municipal legislative bodies. It is to ensure that those elections are free and fair. And I think that's a very important thing to just to put on the side of our heads as we go through this conversation, because it will give context to some of the reasons why we do certain things in a particular way and not in another. And then finally, we are then charged with declaring those elections as free and fair. Okay, so that is what the Electoral Commission is set up to do. So what do we make of social media? Let me talk about the positives. The positive thing about the growth of social media in South Africa and everywhere else is that it allows the Electoral Commission to reach a wide audience of people that I think it would not otherwise reach if it relied on traditional media, if it relied on boots on the ground. So what social media has done is to get us to talk to a wide range of South Africans, the non-voting public and the voting public in real time and deal with questions. Now that is the positive. We also, as the Electoral Commission, like the fact that it has liberalized, I think, sources of news. And that in itself, I think, is a good thing. It is good to have a wide range of people telling you what is happening in a particular corner and deploying and then paying attention to that. So it has given us a kind of reach that we did not have before the advent of social media. But how has it impacted our work? It has impacted our work in ways that I think William alluded to in his introductory remarks. It has, because people are themselves reporters, we do not have the rigor that is something you have in traditional news, where you've got the right of response, things have been checked, etc., etc. People more knowledgeable of journalism and all of those things are going to talk about those subjects. I am just talking very briefly about how it has affected us. So what it has done is that if you look at the growth of the use of social media within the Electoral Commission, we started very deliberately to use social media in 2016. 2016, we were approaching a local government election similar to what it is that we are preparing for in 2021. And what we did is that we partnered with Telkom, for example, and they had a team in our National Results Operations Center. So as people were tweeting, posting things on Facebook, etc., we had a team of people who worked with a team of people inside the Electoral Commission to verify if that was true or not. One of the very, very intransigent things that is posted on social media on voting day is that someone has found a batch of ballot papers lying on the road. They are always lying on the road, and they are always available for someone to take a picture of. So, and those pictures are run every single time. So we have those ones, and we are able to trace who has posted that information and put in place some kind of corrective measures. one of the things that we also saw happening in 2016 is that someone would say that there is someone in the queue who is wearing a T-shirt of a certain political party, and then would respond to the person that is posted and say to them, kindly take a picture and post it for us, so that we can verify whether that person is indeed a staff member of the Electoral Commission. So it has changed the way that you work, because it came to that the Electoral Commission has to put in resources behind this facility that we have. And by the way, I am not talking about the characteristic slurs, I think, towards not just the Electoral Commission as an organization, but in individuals in the Electoral Commission. And I think that just characterizes our politics in South Africa, and I'm sure in parts of the world as well. So that is really how it has changed our work. But I think it is important to say that as an election management body, we are not in favor of shutdowns of social media during tough times. We believe that as hard as it may be to engage with social media, to manage what it is, its negative aspects, I think it is not a correct response to shut down social media. I think it is better to learn in the fire how to deal with that and to be as swift as possible as the Electoral Commission. However, when you are running an election, some things you just literally, it takes a long time to investigate, and you just don't have the capacity to investigate it. I was also asked to comment on disinformation and why it is so dangerous. And if you want me to do this right away or to do it a little bit later in this discourse, please give me an indication. Otherwise, I will just continue. The rise of disinformation, and since I'm the first panelist to speak, disinformation is a deliberate attempt to misinform people. It has this sinister nature of it. The most innocuous that we have encountered as the Electoral Commission is people posting that on the elections are going to be run on let's say 3 days. First day is going to be voters that are voting for party X. Second day voting for party Y, etc., etc. That is characteristic. We've had it in all the elections. Secondly, what we've had as disinformation is when you're going through something very, very complex, like what it is that the Electoral Commission has gone through in response to COVID. Because we are dealing with platforms where, first of all, just about 140 characters, I think, it's very, very difficult to develop an argument about why you're choosing that. Let me give you a simple example. It is simple to me, may not be simple to everyone else. For example, there is a conversation about why does the Electoral Commission even take up this matter about whether elections can be free and fair in the context of COVID. And let me try to answer that question. So you do not have the time on the platforms to argue the following, that actually it was not the Electoral Commission that opened the conversation about whether it was possible to hold elections on the 27th of October. It was in fact political parties who felt that the regulations that were designed to curb the spread of COVID-19 had not allowed them to, for example, campaign. So for the first time in the history of South Africa, the Electoral Commission running elections, the National Party Liaison Committee could not find agreement amongst the parties that sit in that structure. And so we evolved a section in the Electoral Commission Act section 14.4, which says that the Electoral Commission, the Commission can publish a report that looks at whether if you do run an election, the election can be free and fair. And then, et cetera, et cetera. Now, can you imagine trying to fit all of that into a tweet on social media? And because already the discussion right from get-go was very polarized, and the proponents of one stance pushed one element of it, and the proponents of another. And there wasn't quite space to have an objective and what is it, a much more guided conversation. So when you deal with disinformation, people trying to push their own agenda, in other words, behaving as though they are entitled to their own facts, because I certainly agree with that they are entitled to their opinions, but I do not believe that they're entitled to their own facts, however you define a fact. So you do not have that. Not only that, the stance of the Electoral Commission is that we do not have arguments with political parties on media. It is a long-standing policy of the Electoral Commission. Why is that? It's because we have structures that are created by law where we have these debates. But the downside of taking that stance is that the media then chooses its favorite people who go and talk on matters. And suddenly you have many experts in constitutional law. And they go out there and they say, some of them are charismatic and they have more time. So that is what it is that we're faced with. The issue of the attack on the Electoral Commission's integrity is not good for anyone. It's not good for the Electoral Commission. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for anything. Because once you attack the integrity of the election management body, you are setting up the entire country for a failure when the results are published. What we are seeing more and more is that when contestants can't mount a formidable race, they attack the Electoral Commission. We've seen quite a lot of that. They discredit the Electoral Commission as an organization. They also discredit certain individuals in elections. Let me pause there because I did not look at the time when I started, and knowing myself, I probably have exceeded 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Dr. Masuku, that was absolutely enlightening and very interesting that the IEC has that policy not to engage with political parties on social media, because it definitely can descend into mudslinging. And obviously, this is an example of the IEC using social media for informing people instead of sort of mudding the waters. And I think that South Africa benefits from it as a result. We will move on now to Nomshado Lubisi, who is, as I said earlier, from Media Monitoring Africa. You're going to speak to us about civil society and how civil society can play a role in keeping track around disinformation and misinformation. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I think Dr. Masuku actually spoke a bit on what I wanted to highlight on, but I'd like to start and say we are living in an era where the freedom of expression is thriving, right? Where any citizen can voice their opinion on societal issues or can actually hold the power to account, right? However, the very same space that has expanded the sphere of communication, that has allowed communities to come together globally, locally, is the very same space that disinformers are using to manipulate narratives, right? However, the same thing that Dr. Masuku mentioned about the deliberate intent on it is the very same threat that we have to our democracy, especially during an election period. And I'd like to just take 2 steps back and speak on what do I mean when I say disinformation, and most importantly, what I mean when I say misinformation, because I feel like we really need to educate, public citizens on what we mean when we're speaking on disinformation. So disinformation, as Dr. Masuku mentioned, obviously it's information or narratives that was created with a deliberate intent to either instill fear, to manipulate outcomes or to influence any sort of thinking, especially in this case, elections, right? And misinformation is sharing that content, that disinformative content, without the deliberate intention of actually pushing that narrative. So what I am doing as a regular citizen, when I am seeing information online and I just share it without taking 2 steps back and double checking, is this actually factual information? And speaking on this and this gap that we saw at MMA, that we now know what we're dealing with, although society calls it fake news, we like to use the term disinformation because it's actually naming it for what it is, right? But we also need to look at the how, and we also need to look at the why. And that is why in 2018, as Media Monitoring Africa, we saw that there is a need of filling a gap and a mechanism that needs to come into place that empowers societal citizens to be able to actually take what they're seeing online that they know is not factual, and they can actually take it and submit it as a complaint. And this is dealing and giving a solution, right, to what we've been seeing happening online. However, I cannot stress this enough. We cannot work on it by ourselves. We really, really need to stress a multi-stakeholder approach. And this is also speaking to the other organizations that as MMA we are collaborating with, such as Africa Check, CABC, SANEF, Press Council, even the IEC themselves, who share the same mandate to ensure that we are, number 1, combating disinformation, but number 2, equipping citizens with the digital literacy skills that currently are lacking when we're talking about fake news, disinformation, and misinformation. And emphasizing on the multi-stakeholder approach, in 2019, when Real Phone On was launched, we actually partnered up with the IEC as a mechanism that could assist them to handle the complaints that are coming from social media or online spaces. And with that, we actually saw how Real Phone One highlighted the narratives that were going around at that time. I'll just pick up an example as well. There was a narrative going around saying that women with artificial nails could not go and vote. Now imagine a woman sitting at home with that mindset and what that influence has on her further actions going forward. And we also saw how people were taking that and just sharing it without actually double checking as to, is this true or is it not true? And that highlights for me the power of disinformation, especially on social media during elections. And just going back onto the multi-stakeholder approach and how all key stakeholders need to jump on board to ensure that we are collectively combating disinformation. I don't believe that a single organization can do this by themselves. I don't believe that IEC could do this by themselves. And that's where civil society comes in, and the importance of civil society, because that is our mandate, to ensure that, number one, human rights are adhered to. And what we've seen with disinformation is that it's manipulating in such a way that I can't exercise my rights fully because there's so many different narratives that are going around. And just to stress on digital literacy, one of the things that MMA, we've got the 5 C's, right? I'm not going to name them all, but we're looking at context, we're looking at content, we're looking at credibility. And we need to have a shift of behavior on how we actually interact with information online. We need to instill, for example, the 5 C's. I mean, different organizations have different tips and tools, but we call them the 5 C's because before you actually share or before you actually comment, you're already in yourself behaving in such a way that, is this factual or is it not, right? And emphasizing on that as well, my last point, I'll be fast because I know Dr. Masuku kind of took a bit of what I wanted to say, which is great. But my last point is to the political parties, and I'd like to actually directly say this to them. What they are doing now, they are currently creating media assets, they're creating messaging, they're creating different, posters that we're seeing online. However, they need to seriously ensure that they have disinformation in their minds when they're doing this. Because in small instances, we've seen how a digital poster online was slightly manipulated to push a certain message, right? Even though it was not the original ad by the political party. However, when it was shared and manipulated, people are reading different messages. And this is where a second platform comes in called Padre. And this is basically a repository whereby political parties can upload their actual ads that they've created for their campaigning. And I, as a normal citizen, can go there and verify, is this what this party is saying? Is this their message for this campaigning period? Because as I say, when they're doing this themselves, they're positioning themselves as key players, participation, well, not participation, but I would say they're positioning themselves as key participators, as joining us, civil society, different stakeholders, combating disinformation.
Thank you very much. And I think that it's a very important point. Before you share, take 2 steps back and ask yourself the differences. I think I definitely know that in 2019, your initiative had played an immense role and made it easier for us as the media as well in sifting through fact fiction. And I think that in the 2021 municipal elections, you're going to see the value of this going. For last speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Jan-Hinrik Schmidt, who comes with a very unique experience, and that is the German experience. You guys have it a little bit different there, Doc, in terms of the internet penetration being almost at 100%, whereas in South Africa it's a lot less than that. And you have passed laws in relation to this. So you can share with us your thoughts this afternoon.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all organizations involved for the invitation. I would love to be in South Africa now in person, but I'm also happy that I can at least be here digitally. So from Northern Hamburg to South Africa, moin moin. Let me give you 2 bits of information on the context of our German situation, and then focus on the legislative aspects. So we are heading for a national federal election, which is coming up this Sunday. So only 3 or 4 days left. And it's going to be a unique election because Angela Merkel, who has been chancellor for the last 16 years now, I think, since 2005, is not running again. And actually, as far as I know, the first time in the history of Germany after the Second World War, we have an election where the incumbent is not running again. So this is a unique situation. You might also want to know that this election, we don't directly elect chancellor, but we elect the members of parliament who then elect the chancellor. So it's basically parties and the sort of the running heads of the parties that are competing for attention, because one of them might in the end be elected chancellor. And we have a unique situation in terms of our media system. You already mentioned our internet penetration. Almost everyone in Germany now has access to the internet. If you ask people where they get their news from, we have the situation that television, like traditional linear television, and the internet are actually tied. So around 70% of the population says they use TV news, at least regularly. And about the same number says they use the internet for news. So TV and internet are tied. And if you ask them, what's your main source of information on current events? TV and internet is tied as well. Then it's about 40% who name each of these 2 channels as their main source. Social media is treated as part of the digital media of the internet. About 30% say that they use social media for news. And then if you ask in more detail, what kind of social media, they will usually say Facebook, YouTube, or WhatsApp. These are the 3 main social media platforms people in Germany use for news. But only 10% say they use social media as their main source. So when we are talking about social media and election, we know that social media has become important over the years, but it's by far not the most important source. It is one of usually different or various sources people use to get informed and keep informed, especially about the election and the candidates. Now, regarding the role of social media in this current election, I can in a way repeat what I think Dr. Masuku already said, or you, Kanita, said in your introduction. Social media, of course, is very important and helpful because it provides more opportunities for candidates to inform the citizens about their positions, their platforms, what they want to achieve. We can regard social media profiles as part of professionality. When we look at those candidates who are running for one of the 7 parties that are already in parliament, almost more than 80%, about 85% of them have a Facebook page, for example, and about 60% have a Twitter account. So the majority of candidates who are in one of the 7 large parties already use social media. But we also have many, many more candidates. There are, I think it's more than 6,000 individual candidates running for a federal election now, running as candidates. 45 parties and many, many independent candidates as well. And there are many people who are relying on, many candidates who rely on social media to get their message out, because they can't rely on airtime, for example, on television or on radio. So for them, social media is an important and very, very important opportunity to become visible. Having said that, I don't think social media will, in the end, decide who is going to be elected. So I don't think we will have any candidate in the end in the parliament or even chancellor being elected because of his or her social media activities. Usually the results will depend, of course, on broader visibility across other media forms, as well as belonging to one of the major parties. So even if you have a perfectly orchestrated social media campaign, but if you belong to a small party or running as an independent, to be honest, you won't have a real chance to become a member of parliament. So this is for the positive sides. Regarding the problems, well, we've already heard a lot about disinformation, and I agree with what Nomshado and Dr. Masuku said. We can observe disinformation in the German election campaign as well. We see many instances of disinformation focusing on particular candidates, especially on the main candidates. So over the last weeks, the race has focused on basically on 3 persons, 2 male candidates from the Conservative Party and the Social Democratic Party, and 1 female candidate from the Green Party. And especially the candidate from the Green Party, the woman, Anna Baerbock, has been the focus of many disinformation content. And we can also find disinformation focusing on rather broad institutions or the general electoral process, so that people will question whether the election will be safe, whether they will assert that it's a problem that many people will vote via mail and not in person. Fortunately, we have a lot of institutions that try to combat disinformation. We have watchdog organizations, we have journalistic fact-checking initiatives. Our Federal Election Commissioner has a page on his website where he debunks fake news or disinformation regarding the electoral process in detail. So, I mean, it's always a sort of a battle or competition between those who want to distribute disinformation and those who combat it. But as I said, on social media in general, I also don't think that disinformation will decide the election. That's one thing. I mean, hopefully I'm not proven wrong, but that's the impression I get from observing what's going on over the last weeks. But we have one important thing to notice here. At least part of the disinformation that we see in the German context now is probably or almost definitely part of orchestrated campaigns. So it's coming from actors who have an interest in undermining trust in our democratic institutions, who want to undermine the trust of citizens in democratic parties, in democratic institutions like all those institutions on the local and regional level who organize the elections. And sadly, we have to note that part of this, these disinformation campaigns, these orchestrated campaigns, are actually seem to be, and I find it plausible, seem to be coming from other countries, particularly Russia. So that's something where we definitely have to be careful and watchful over the next years to see what is happening there, because there are good reasons to think that disinformation is an important part of sort of the battle on the global level. We might talk about that later in the discussion in more detail. My last point is, as I've been asked to talk about the regulatory or legal instruments. for 4 years now, since 2017, we have a particular legal act in Germany, which is called in German the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. That's a typical German, long German word. It means Network Enforcement Act. And in this act, it is targeted especially to combat hate speech. So broader term for a communication that is attacking people, for example, defamation or insults, or but also incitements to crime or hatred against certain groups. And with this act, the large platforms like Facebook, for example, YouTube, Instagram, etc., are obliged to implement mechanisms that users can notify them about content the users think is sort of breaching a law. So that's important to note that this act is regulating content that is breaching, that is sort of punishable by criminal reasons. So it is not to enforce content that is breaching the community guidelines of the platforms. That's a separate act. So the platform providers have their own community guidelines, so the house rules, and that's a separate thing. But if a user is notifying a platform about certain content that might breach, let's say that is insulting and is sort of fulfilling the legal criteria for an insult, which is punishable under criminal law, then the platform provider has to implement mechanisms to check this complaint and decide within 7 days, in very blatant, obvious cases within 24 hours, to remove this content. And the platform providers, by this regulatory act, have to publish reports every 6 months on how many complaints they received, how many content they remove, and these reports are then checked to see whether there are any systematic problems, and if there are systematic problems. So if we see that the platforms fail to systematically combat these offenses, these criminal offenses on their these problematic speech on their platforms, then they are subject to actually very heavy fines. So there hasn't been any sort of fine yet to be issued against one of the platforms. So by now, or up to now, it seems to be working. There is the fear that the system might lead to overblocking, so that the platform providers are erring on the side of caution and are removing content, which in the end might turn out to not be problematic. So not be problematic by terms of the criminal law. But this hasn't been sort of analyzed systematically and empirically yet. But this is like in general, this is a fear by installing this regime of complaints and restrictions that companies are sort of incentivized to remove more content than they actually should do. And there is another problematic aspect. The system lays the responsibility of deciding which content is sort of still okay and which content is not okay. This responsibility is located with the platform providers and their moderation teams and their moderation routines. But we are talking about issues here which should and usually are within the power of courts, basically, because in the end, courts are the ones who decide whether some statement is still protected by the freedom of expression, or whether it is to be punished under criminal law, for example, because it's an insult or an incitement to crime. So this law, depending on your perspective on it, has been a good way to further combat hate speech, but on the other hand, might lead to unintended consequences. Again, it has been installed 4 years ago. There has been a first formal evaluation, which has kind of a mixed result. So I expect that after this election with the new government, we might see some reforms to this act, but I don't think it will be sort of removed completely. It will probably be evaluated and then be developed further. So these are my introductory statements. I'm very, very open, very curious to your questions and the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan-Hinrik Schmidt. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. Quite fascinating, in terms of the intersection of the law then with disinformation and misinformation. I think that there has been some sort of calls for greater, stronger legislation rather, around disinformation and misinformation. But obviously there is the flip side to it as well, that one cannot be, not take cognizance of. But I think I'm going to go back to Dr. Masuku to pose a question to her. But before that, if you are watching, feel free to pose questions to the panelists. Type in the chat box on Zoom, send us your questions, and we will definitely read them out and ask the panelists. We have about 15 minutes or so left, so I would like to make the most of this time. And so would definitely like to get to all of your questions. Pose it in the chat box and we'll read it out and direct it to the different panelists. Dr. Masuku, do you find, if you compare 2019 to 2021, there's a greater awareness of what is mis and disinformation or / fake news? Even if it may be rising, there is a lot more digital literacy around it.
Okay, thank you very much, Connie. Look, my impression is not. My impression is that in South Africa, there isn't outright, let's say, hate speech as such. But rather what you find is that you find statements, for example, that second guess the decision-making process of the election management body. For example, if I can give you an example about just the last registration weekend, where South Africa has, the Electoral Commission has introduced a new machine that is called a voter management device. So first time on the field, and as we all know, any app is going to perform differently when you're rolling it en masse. So the first time you test it, you roll it, okay? And then what we find is that the mapping capability is slowing down the system, and we make a conscious decision to shut down the mechanism and make the machine work offline. But the story that comes through is that all systems fell out. You know, it was a mess. Things didn't work, etc., etc. And so what you find that is that it is true that happened, but what is not being discussed is what the Electoral Commission is saying about why the machines were taken offline. Because I think that is not sexy. What is sexy is to say that the Electoral Commission, they don't know what they're doing and all of those things, and that is repeated over and over again. So I imagine that even with a facility, as I think as progressive as Real 411, Real 411 is very important as an important development in the life of election management, because it gives agency to people to say, this is not true, and take the initiative, not just to feel offended by that post, but rather to consciously put in to lodge a complaint. So what you have is that in South Africa, what is happening is that things are not really, it's not really disinformation, it's the interpretation of what is happening, which is totally incorrect. And if you were to sit and look at just the wide range of conversations that are intended to second guess the decision-making processes of the Electoral Commission, I don't think you'd be able to run an election. So what do? You make a conscious decision to get the team to focus on the things that you can push out to correct the narrative. But what we find is that those corrections, they don't get retweeted very often. They don't make it, they're totally ignored because they're not cool. They're truly not cool. and it doesn't make for good conversation. So that really is my interpretation. I know that it sounds cynical, but I don't think you can actually run elections without having some healthy dose of cynicism.
Definitely a lot more than, I don't know if you have any more than us journalists, but more than Nomshado, yeah. But coming to you, Nomshado, the one thing that I often worry about is precedence, right? So do we see when leaders of political parties, famous people, celebrities lead the charge in relation to mis or disinformation, that you then see it trickle down and have a far more wider reach? What are your observations?
I'm glad you touched on that one, because these individuals obviously have such great followings, and they have people, you could call it a fan base, or they are followers of people that really stand by them, their ideas and ideologies, or their talents, if it is a musician, for example. So if you, as a key individual with such a huge following, post something that could really disrupt, whether it's an election process or something like COVID, you know, it has such a huge impact. I can't even emphasize how much, because they see you as a trusted individual. They see you as a source that they could easily go to because you are this large person in society. And then once that happens, it also comes back to saying, if you now come with a counter narrative to say that, but actually that is not true, this is true, you're almost seen as, those individuals are almost seen as targeting the person or the key influencer in this whole picture. And at the end of the day, we are just dealing with the information. We're dealing with the content. And that's why it's important that you yourself see yourself as a responsible person, that whatever you're sharing, whether it's your opinions or thoughts, that's great. But if it's factual information and you're putting it as factual, ensure that that is the case.
So the IEC's broken voting machine systems is not a plot by a particular party.
Well, in that case, as Dr. Masuku just said right now, that speaking about the truth is not cool. And people want to, and that's the thing about disinformation that I couldn't touch on earlier. It always has a percentage of truth in it to be able to kind of lure people
and
in and culture them and speak to them, because a part of it is speaking to the truth of it, although the large part of it is not, and that is obviously the case.
Dr. Schmidt, you mentioned earlier around, sort of gendered harassment or disinformation. We saw that in South Africa when we had the high state capture and bots, targeted attacks against journalists at that time. Do you see, I mean, besides, talk a little bit about, the gendered disinformation, but what other trends do you see in relation to disinformation around elections?
One trend I touches on the distinction I made in my introduction, that we find disinformation that is focusing on particular persons, and this is usually disinformation focusing on the prominent, like the leading candidates or the leading, or maybe some prominent figures. So, for example, we also have disinformation focusing on those politicians who have been exposed during the COVID pandemic because they are specialized in health politics, for example. So there are several. So they are targets not only of harassment and hate speech, but also of disinformation, where misleading or fabricated facts about them are circulating. The other trend is, I think, more. And that's a more worrying one, because this is disinformation that is directed at our institutions, our democratic institutions, which might be harder to disprove in some way, because people might actually not be familiar with the working of our electoral system. For example, how mail-in voting is organized, and so if there's misinformation about who is having access to mail-in ballots, for example. Misinformation is spreading. This is something that is not as easily disproved, since, as you said, the truth is not sexy enough to be spread in the same way, on the same scale as the disinformation.
Yeah.
A second or last trend I want to mention is that it seems, this is an impression I have, it's not part of an empirical or based on empirical findings. We are not there yet with our empirical analysis, but this disinformation is coming from certain parts of the political spectrum at the moment. So our election is taking place against the background of the COVID pandemic, obviously. During the pandemic, we in Germany witnessed, as many other countries witnessed, the rise of a group within society, not the majority, but a group, and a solid group within society who was very critical. We call them Querdenker, which is just something like thinking in a different way. These are people who question every measurement and every initiative aimed to fight the pandemic. And some of these people are now going into election because they are running for parties, large parties or smaller parties, or they are contributing to the debate in this election. And this is sort of a part of the ecosystem, if you want, of our social media discourse here in Germany, where we find more disinformation, where disinformation is also catching up with people. You might call that echo chambers, for example, or that they live in filter bubbles, that they don't question what they see. But even if that is not true, this is something we can witness, that disinformation is circulating in certain groups and networks of actors. And this is something where we actually have to develop more instruments to monitor these, not in the sort of sense of surveillance or even state surveillance, that's not what I meant, but monitor maybe as scientific or academic institutions to see what is going on and to be able to react to them accordingly.
And I suppose when you say monitor, that's where civil society obviously plays a role. But Dr. Schmidt, staying with you as we, edge to closing, Ayanda posed a question about some social media platforms have provisions to combat misinformation and disinformation, but they are not a standard across the platform because we're in different countries. Do you think we could sort of lobby these platforms to have a standardized way of reporting misinformation and disinformation? And you think would there be any benefit in that?
I'm skeptical, to be honest, because I'm not here to defend the platforms, but I recognize that they're in a tough spot here because they're operating globally, and the standards for assessing what is still sort of okay, with what content is sort of breaching rules and norms, that standard might differ. There might be cases where everyone on the world agrees that it is not okay to, for example, to murder someone, but there are other gray areas, for example, and I don't know whether we want the platform providers to be the one authority that sets global standards on freedom of expression and sort of where the boundaries are. I think there are still good reasons to relate that to state actors, to courts, for example, and to civil society, of course, to debate this in the light of their own cultural standards. That is not to say that I want to imply that there are countries where misinformation or fake news or lies are okay. That's not true. But I think the standards to measure them and the mechanisms to fight them, they are different, and I think they should be taken into account differently.
Sure. There's a comment by one of our viewers, Derek. He says, disinformation is one of the many political tactics that are becoming a normal feature of politics within our post-truth world. We want to hold platforms accountable, but in fact, we are shooting the messenger and not addressing the source of post-truth thinking and their political motivations. I think there's definitely a valid point there. Just to wrap up now, we have 2 minutes, Dr. Masuku. Any final thoughts before I bring it to Nomshado?
Thank you very much. And as my final thought, I'm going to talk about, I think, what Dr. Schmidt has talked about establishing relationships with the platforms. So by these multi-sectoral partnerships with civil society, with platforms in South Africa, we are experimenting with that. But of course, I do share Dr. Schmidt's thoughts about it is very important to know the limitations that platforms have and the framework within which they are able to deal with disinformation. Remember that they are global entities, and remember that they are bound by a certain framework. I once participated in a conversation that said that the people who run these businesses as platforms, they have they have an agenda. They know what it is that they want from that service. And I think as we collaborate across multiple kinds of sections of society, it is important to begin to talk about what it is that we want from these platforms, rather than wait for them to address what it is that we need from them. If we are able to state the boundaries, then maybe we stand a better chance over time of developing certain instruments where there can be a much more nuanced approach to what it is that is permissible and what it is that does indeed create an environment that is conducive to free and fair elections in a country like South Africa, for example. And I think as we collaborate, we will sharpen our ability to set those standards and develop them over time. Thank you.
Nomshado, collaboration, that's what Dr. Masuku says.
Yeah.
I'm sure you agree.
Largely so. And I mean, she's speaking to one of the key things that, and I think that's why maybe we get in different countries, different methodologies of interacting with the big tech companies. And also, I mean, Dr. Jan spoke about how, we all have, for example, different definitions of hate speech. We all have different laws dealing with, different aspects of the digital offenses. But my biggest emphasis is, especially now that we're seeing an influx of information, especially around key periodic areas, areas such as, your pandemic, but now our elections, it's very important that you do not sit with the digital literacy by yourself, especially if you are part of public groups, WhatsApp groups, etc. Ensure that you're empowering yourself and others to make sure that they understand that not all that you see can be factual, and to always double check what you see. And if you are not sure, there are various tools that you can use. And one of them, and obviously it was mentioned a number of times, is please go to www.real41.org. I sound like an ad right now, but I cannot emphasize the power that this platform has, in the sense that you can get everything there. You can actually also see what complaints have been coming through. So if you're not sure of, for example, political party A said they're saying this about that, that's the place you can go and double check on. So for me, it's just the emphasis of digital literacy, and obviously empowering yourself as a citizen to actually take action against what you see online that are false narratives.
Thank you very much, Nomshado. And Dr. Schmidt, you guys are going into elections before us. Just any parting thoughts?
The one thought is that I agree with what both my panelists, my colleagues said here, that my previous remarks shouldn't imply that the platforms don't have any responsibility. That's maybe not important to stress. They have, but as Dr. Masuku said, they only have it in the context of a broader multi-stakeholder approach. So we shouldn't rely on them alone to set the standards. That's the point I wanted to make. Besides that, I have no further remarks, but to say thank you that I had the opportunity to discuss with you and learn from your experience and your background. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. This was definitely a fascinating discussion about a very important topic. We cannot talk about elections in 2021 without talking about the role of social media. I hope this was a fascinating discussion. I hope you learned from our esteemed panelists, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Closing words from me. Thank you to the viewers, listeners. Thank you so
Actually
much,
ran.
Dr. Masuku, for your wisdom. Thank you, Jan, for your lovely, excellent input as well. We really appreciate it. A big thanks to our lovely friends at the Goethe Institute. This place is amazing. They've got an incredible library. They do amazing programs on coding and all sorts of really, really cool stuff. You really must get down here if you get a chance. And then a huge thanks to our other lovely friends at the German Embassy. Thank you for your ongoing continued support. I've got some gifts. He walks off stage here. I'm still there. Unfortunately, Dr. Masuku, you would be receiving one of these exciting bags. But alas, because and it's really nice stuff in here, but so we'll have to give you one virtually. But I'm going to then just start with Kanita. Thank you so much for facilitating our
And I will
discussion.
declare it as appropriate.
It's a lovely gift, I'm telling you. And then I'm going to hand it out to my colleague. Of course, she'll have to declare this and give it straight back to me. All of the good things. She gets to keep it. But thank you to our lovely tech team and everyone behind the scenes that make this happen. There's a huge bank of screens and everything. It really is really cool when you have professionals making this happen. So thanks, everyone. We hope to see you soon. Get vaccinated, get registered, vote, report to Real 411, follow credible news media. The end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.